Yes. Perfect. Have a great morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you guys in the 58th Expo Books and Magazine of the Faculty of Accounting and Management, made in the highest house of students in our country, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. We have now the presentation of book, Políticas Sociales y Económicas para reducir la pobreza en América Latina by Santosh. Today, we have the presence of P.H. Santosh Merotra, P.H. Daniel Koster, and P.H. Teresa Belmont. Welcome. Remember, guys, that if you have any questions, enter to the chat and the YouTube channel, and you can write your questions. There are, at the end, I will share them. Now, I will read the semblance of the P.H. Santosh. Let me read. Santosh Merotra is professor of Econ, Center of Labor, Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. After an AM in Econ from New School for Social Research, New York, and PhD in Cambridge University, Santosh was associate professor of economics. He spent 15 years with the United Nations in research position, heading UNICEF's Global Research Program and the Innocenti Research Center, Florence, and as chief economist of the Global Human Development Report, New York. He returned to India to head the Rural Development Division and Development Policy Division of Planning Commission, and was lead author of several chapters of the 11 and 12 5-year plans of India. He was also the Director General of the National Institute of Labor Economics Research Planning Commission in the rank of the Secretary to the Government of India. He consults for the World Bank, UNESCO, Young Woman. His work has been translated into Hindi, Spanish, French, Russian, German, and Portuguese. He has published 13 books, 3 with Cambridge University Press, 4 with Oxford University Press, 3 with Sage, and 1 with Rodwick, 1 with Penguin Random House, and 1 with Saint Press. And now with us, other one. We are very grateful to have you here with us. Welcome. And I'm going to introduce you P.H. Teresa Belmont, who was very important in this process to making the book. Welcome, Belmont. We listen to you. Great.
Okay.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Sí, pues vamos a iniciar. Entonces, la primera presentación la va a dar el doctor Merotra. Posteriormente yo apoyaré con un resumen general. Y posteriormente el doctor Koster para continuar posteriormente con sus preguntas y respuestas. Entonces, thank you very much. Please go ahead, Dr. Santosh.
Thank you, Jenny and Tere. First of all, I want to begin by thanking UNAM and FCA in particular, as well as the University of Guadalajara, which have jointly published my book in Spanish, and I'm very grateful to them. And I'm particularly grateful to Jenny Esquivel and Dr. Jose Mendez, who managed this whole operation for over the last few years, and I'm truly grateful. I want all of you to know that this is an open source book. You can download it from the website of both UNAM FCA as well as the University of Guadalajara. So it's free and freely available to everyone. I'm particularly grateful to Dr. Tere Belmont, who translated the book. And finally, I want to thank Dr. Daniel Koster, who is currently in Brussels. I'll introduce him later. He is one of those who's read the book, endorsed the book. He's a very well-known Argentinian economist. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce the book to you. The flow of this webinar is that I will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then I'll hand over to Tere, who will actually summarize what I have said in Spanish for the benefit of those who might not be so comfortable with English. And then we'll request Dr. Daniel to speak about the book and about the issues that I raise in the book. And then you'll have chance. So of course, I'll be answering questions, which I guess will be put to me by Tere. So let me share screen. I'm going to start my, there we are. I guess you can see this. Very good. Let me see if I can go to slide show. I want to go to slideshow. Okay, you can see this now, I assume. Please say yes or no. Someone tell me.
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm gonna start. So this is the title of the book in English, Reducing Poverty in Latin America. And what I do in this presentation is to apply what I call a dual synergies model, which is what underlies the book. It runs through much of the analysis in the book as you will read it, applying the dual synergies model, which I have developed to Latin America. I've used it for my own work in India and in Asian countries. So I apply this dual synergies model to Latin America to draw lessons from Asia in terms of policy. So let me begin with this very simple presentation of the model, where if you look on the top, you've got economic growth, and then you've got economic income poverty reduction, and here you've got human capabilities. And notice that there is an arrow running between economic growth and human capabilities, but it's pointing in both directions. And the same thing applies to human capabilities and income poverty reduction. There is an arrow, but which runs in both directions. And the same thing applies to economic growth and income poverty. The point here is that there is a mutually interactive relationship or a synergistic relationship between economic growth and income poverty, and between income poverty and human capabilities, and between human capabilities or human capital and economic growth. So in other words, this is a synergistic model. That's why I call it a dual synergy. I'm here in the interest of time, only presenting the major synergy which underlies the book. This essentially is arguing, this analytical model is essentially suggesting that, you see, economic growth is good for income poverty reduction. Similarly, income poverty reduction is good for economic growth. So there is a mutual interaction, and which is beneficial to both. Similarly, reducing poverty through economic growth is good for human capital development of any society. And human capital development is similarly good because for economic growth, because what it does is essentially it enhances human capital, which is inherent in the labor force, and hence increases labor productivity. And it also improves in other words, high levels of human capital also improves the innovative capacity of the economy, and hence enables the generation of new technologies, which of course generates growth. So you understand conceptually, I'm not going to go into any more detail in this because I'm whetting your appetite. And what I will do, in fact, is apply this conceptual framework to Latin America and show why this relationship between economic growth and poverty is weak, and why this relationship is weak and this relationship is weak in Latin America. So moving on very quickly, I just want to say very briefly, where can we locate these formulations that I've just presented to you in development theory or economic theory? The first, of course, is the capabilities approach associated with Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. Sen currently teaches at Harvard. Nussbaum currently teaches in the University of Chicago. There's a whole capabilities approach which is associated with the names of these, and this essentially elaborates on the capabilities approach while remaining within the framework. It also, in some ways, derives some of its value from being a takeoff on new growth theory. And finally, it's rooted very much in public policy, because I'll draw implications for what public policy could be in Mexico or in other Latin American countries, because this is work which is rooted in institutional economics. I won't make any more theoretical points. I'm moving very rapidly, quickly to an application to Latin America, and I will, periodically over this presentation keep talking about comparisons with Asia, because I'm an Asian economist, Indian economist, who's been coming to Latin America for the last 25 years. And I've had the good fortune of traveling to almost every Latin American country many times over the last 25 to 27 years for professional reasons. So although I'm not speaking to you in Spanish, I do have a bit of an understanding of Latin America apart from of Asia. So the growth-poverty relationship, as I began by saying, why do I think it is relatively weak, and why, despite the fact that most Latin American countries are upper middle income countries, very close to the threshold of becoming high income countries like Canada or the United States or the other G7 countries, but they haven't managed to actually move up and move into high income category, and one very important reason is the weakness of the relationship between growth and income poverty in Latin America. So I'm going to sort of make a broad point about what the pattern of growth in much of Latin American countries has been, which includes Mexico, even though it's relatively industrialized. It includes Brazil and Argentina, which are relatively more industrialized. But by and large, the pattern of growth, even in these relatively more industrialized countries of Latin America, has been an extractive industry-based model. In other words, Latin American countries export primary commodities, and they were doing it, in 1990, for instance, 2/3 of all total exports in Latin America based on are extractive industries, based on primary commodities. And since 2000, Latin America saw an increased inflow of foreign direct investment, especially investments in natural resources. This pattern deepened the existing extractive industry structure in the 2000s, in this century. And while in the 1990s, the exports of primary products as a proportion of total exports had been decreasing. It decreased from about 67% to 41% in 2000. But with rising foreign direct investment into natural resources, in 2000, it had increased again to 61%, and by 2011. Okay, so you see, what we find, in fact, is that post-2008 global economic crisis, FDI flows to Latin America really peaked. And this is quite opposite to the FDI flows worldwide, which were shrinking. And this surge in investment continued until 2012, which unfortunately entrenched this pattern of extractive growth. So you can see what higher share of many metals are produced in Latin America, in the world. And other than agricultural production, there's oil, gas, and metals remain central to the region's exports. So I give you 5 or 6 reasons why this relationship is weak. The relationship, in other words, even when growth takes place, it doesn't reduce poverty very much. because very few jobs are created in this extractive model in the non-farm sector. And this is because the main problem of the extraction model is that, unlike with manufacturing, it cannot by design take locational advantage of existing infrastructure, markets, and labor supply. And natural resource extraction are necessarily localized in enclaves with linkages to global markets, but very few linkages to local economy. Now, this pattern of growth is actually very different from the one followed in most East Asian economies. As Dr. Daniel will bear me out, because he's actually worked in many East Asian countries. And the second reason why this relationship between growth and poverty is weak is that in capital-intensive extractive industries, labor receives rather little. Labor receives less than 10% of world market value of exported minerals, 6% in the case of Argentina and Chile, and 1.2% in the case of Mexico. So, I mean, this is completely different from the pattern of cumulative wage increases in the post-war state-led development that we saw in Asia, which was based on three things. One, labor-seeking foreign direct investment, plus investment in human development, human capital, and labor-intensive industry, which was meant for exports. This was the pattern in East and Southeast Asia. And in Asia, the share of wages, in other words, wages and salaries in the total product is much higher than the 10% that I just mentioned in Latin America. It's 60%. Obviously, when labor receives a higher share, you can understand that the elasticity or the responsiveness of poverty to growth is much greater in Asia than it is in Latin America. In the interest of time, I'm going to move quite rapidly to my sort of, I've already made 2 points, 2 reasons why it's weak. Let me talk about the third reason. When you are heavily dependent upon primary commodities, as the model of growth in Latin America has been, it is very vulnerable to exogenous shocks from external forces. So, for instance, we all remember the debt crisis of the early 1980s, which began after the oil shocks of the 1970s. Latin America borrowed heavily from the international banks in the late 70s on account of the oil shock, and the IMF and the World Bank and international banks all came in with very strong policies, which we all know as neoliberal policies. The result was growth in Latin America through the 1980s and 1990s, a full 2 decades, was slow. And as a result, per capita income was not much higher in the year 2000 than it was in the year 1980. So that's why those 2 decades of the 80s and 90s in Latin America are called lost decades. Growth did happen as global GDP growth rose in the 2000s, early 2000s, at the turn of the century, with China and India and Europe, North America increasing their imports of primary commodities. Latin America boomed. But then came the global economic crisis of 2008, and that surge collapsed. And because that surge collapsed, growth collapsed, and poverty actually increased in recent times. So while there had been a sustained fall in poverty between 2002 and 2015 in Latin America, and I have the numbers there, I don't have the time to go into that, you see when this global economic crisis impacts the Latin American economies, growth slows down again. This is primarily on account of the vulnerability based on extractive industries, and then growth slows down, poverty increases. And I would argue that an underlying reason for the middle income trap that most Latin American countries have been entrenched in is that they are caught in this extractive industry biased production structure. Because we all must remember that there's no country in the world which has managed to sustain long GDP growth and sharply reduce poverty without developing a robust manufacturing. But unfortunately, the share of manufacturing in employment in Latin America, by and large, was only 12.5% in 2010, and it fell thereafter. And it's picked up in recent years to 14.4% in 2017. But these levels in respect to the share of manufacturing is way below what you find way below what you would find in most Asian economies. And a fifth point which I would make in this regard is the low elasticity of poverty to growth is low also because there is a very high share of informality in the workforce, much higher than you find in Asia. So despite the fact that most countries are in Latin America are upper middle income countries, the extractive model generates few jobs in the formal sector, so the vast majority of the workforce is informal. And finally, although only about 10 to 15% or even less of the workforce is in agriculture in Latin America, that agriculture is also very capital intensive. So that also doesn't generate, high levels of income or many jobs. So these are the 5 or 6 reasons why I argue in the book the relationship is very, very weak between poverty and economic growth. Let me turn very quickly to the relationship between growth and human capital, why it is weak in Latin America. Well, you see, globally, we know from the experience of the rich countries, now rich countries, as well as from Asia, that human capital formation is dependent mainly upon state investments. Because health and education are public goods, the state must invest big time. Because the private sector ultimately in the health and education sectors caters to the well-off and not to the majority. But the state's capacity in Latin America to invest in health and education or in economic infrastructure is dependent on the fiscal capacity of the state, which itself, of course, depends upon sustained growth, but also depends upon the tax to GDP ratio, how much tax is collected. So now that's very central to my argument about why, this relationship between growth and human capital is also very weak. It'll be interesting for you to learn that, the tax to GDP ratio in much of Latin America is only as high as in India, when India is only a low middle income country with a per capita income which is a third or a fourth of Brazil or Mexico. And I mean, so having a tax to GDP ratio which is of the order of, so in Mexico it is 21%, but it has only recently risen to that level. For most of the 90s, it was around 14 to 15%. So, but the fact that it has risen gives some sign of hope for the state to make social investments, to realize the dual synergies that I keep talking about in the book, which could drive inclusive growth and therefore reduce poverty. Now, by contrast, most East and Southeast Asian states invested early in development process and school education and in basic health. And as a result, they experience sustained growth, not volatile growth, which goes up and down, sustained growth since the 1980s, just when most of Latin America was experiencing a lost decade. Through the 80s and 90s, most of the Asian economies, were growing and growing and growing. And thus they became the factory of the world, which enabled them to sustain human capital formation, which of course underpinned their growth strategies. And one reason which I argue in the book, and I'll now be much briefer than I've been so far, is that the fiscal capacity of the state to invest in health and education is also impacted by the pattern of financial development in Latin America. You see, if you look at the financial system in Latin America, it is dominated by foreign-owned banks. That's not something that you will ever find in any of the Asian countries. It's not that foreign-owned banks don't exist, they're there, but they are a minority. Most of the banks are either in the public sector, or even if they are in the private sector, they are owned by nationals and not by foreigners. And what's important, and why is this important? foreign direct investment is important to extractive industries in Latin America. And this is mediated mostly by foreign banks, which are themselves mostly multinationals. So this combination keeps the base of the economy relatively narrow, which generates limited tax revenues. And second problem with having too many foreign banks is that they're not interested in financial inclusion. The majority of households would not have in Mexico, or for that matter, much of Latin America, would not have a bank account. So unfortunately, the savings of most poor people are not accessible to the banking sector. Only the savings of the middle class and the upper class are actually available to the banking sector, which keeps savings rates low. So if the savings rate to GDP ratio is low, then clearly there is much less money available for investment. I mean, investment rates are low, growth rates are low. You can see how the feedback loop is working here. Let me quickly move on beyond this, because you can read about these things more carefully in the book, because I want to go to my penultimate slide. I want to look at, this is just my second but last slide, the third relationship. Why is the growth and human capital relationship weak? So I've already mentioned, savings rates in Latin America are 10 to 15 percentage points lower than that in Asian economies. So if savings rates in Asian economies are high, the investment rates are high, and then the growth rates are accordingly much higher. So if we want higher growth in most Latin American countries, investment rates have to be raised, and they can only be raised through domestic savings, domestic investment, and not necessarily through FDI, foreign direct investment. And this is that third relationship that I talked about, the relationship between human capital formation and poverty in Latin America, why they tend to feed on each other. So we all know this stylized fact about most of the Latin American economies. Most Latin American economies have the highest income inequality among all developing regions of the global South. These high levels of inequality and poverty keep household private spending on health and education quite low, which prevents poor households from pulling themselves up by investing in their own or their children's health and educational well-being, which traps them into poverty. And thus, as public spending is constrained, and yet Latin America's demographic dividend is over, most Latin American countries are now aging societies. They're no more, young societies. And because the demographic dividend is over, we have an additional problem that the policymakers in Latin America are facing in the region, which is aging. Just as China is aging, so is Latin America. So the society and state needs to increase spending on two new issues with aging. One is health services for the aged, and then more on social insurance and pensions for the elderly. But a very significant share of the total population of the current workforce is informal. That means they don't have social insurance. So while the population is aging, you've got a situation where still at least 1/3, if not 40% of the workforce are informal and have no social insurance. So this situation can regrettably actually entrench inequality, and this is truly unfortunate. My last slide, and I'm closing. So what are the public policy implications that I try and draw from the book? The book goes into much more detail. I'm going to draw out only 3 or 4 things here. One, on the growth and poverty implications. Well, clearly most economies in the Latin American region need to reduce dependence on extraction, and which requires industrial policy, because industrial policy which will generate manufacturing and which will create manufacturing jobs, it will raise the labor's share in total income, and it will reduce the effects of external shocks upon these economies. These are clear lessons which are coming out of the East Asian experience. on the growth and human capital implications, it's critical that, economies have to, in Latin America, have to raise fiscal capacity of the state if they are to invest in health, education, social transfers. Because we must remember that the rich countries became rich. Between 1880 and 1980, the size of the state became bigger and bigger. Their tax to GDP ratio rose and they spent more. And what did they spend more on? On health, on education, on social transfers. And that's what Latin American economies need to do, which would require, of course, mobilizing new forms of direct taxation, which will also reduce inequality. And of course, Thomas Piketty has written a great deal about this subject, and he actually traces how the European countries managed to achieve precisely what I've just described in 2 sentences. A third point I think that you could take away in terms of policy is there needs to be much more reliance on domestic banks, especially development finance banks, perhaps funded by the state, which would mobilize the savings of the poor and raise savings to investment rates so that investment itself can be raised. And finally, clearly, because the demographic dividend in much of Latin America is over, it's very important that as tax to GDP ratio rises and public expenditure rises as a result of that, the increases in allocations, the increase in public expenditure needs to be focused on health, education, and social transfers, because aging has begun. And, even the informal workers can be provided social insurance before they age, because, Latin America has only just begun to age. The dividend has only just ended. So I would end on a positive note that there is a window of opportunity available to policymakers in Mexico, in Argentina, in Brazil, and most of the other countries to actually follow what I would argue has been the East Asian success story. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes. Then, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Santosh. Then I'm going to explain briefly what you
In Spanish.
Yes, in Spanish. Entonces, pues muy bien, vamos a continuar. Voy a hacer un resumen de lo que comentó el doctor Santosh. Justo, si ven ustedes, existe aquí una relación entre el crecimiento económico con la reducción de la pobreza. Se refiere relativa al ingreso de las personas junto con las capacidades humanas. Aquí justo, ¿qué pasa con esta relación? Habrá que explicarla específicamente para países en América Latina. ¿Qué sucede entre la relación de crecimiento económico con la pobreza? ¿Qué pasa ahí en estas dos relaciones? Lo que sucede ahí es que América Latina es una industria más extractiva. O sea, ¿a qué se refiere una industria más extractiva? Pues a los minerales o al petróleo, o metales, por ejemplo, la parte del hierro, el cobre, el níquel, el zinc, la bauxita, que es como una piedra que ayuda para el calentamiento, o plata, junto con lo que ustedes ya conocen, que es el petróleo. Entonces, básicamente, la economía de países en América Latina está sustentada por este tipo de industria, lo cual a nivel mundial genera el 10%, genera el 10% de la economía a nivel mundial, que no es mucho, el 6% en Argentina, lo que mencionó el doctor, y el 1.2% en México. ¿Qué ¿qué pasa en esto? ¿Por qué hay relación con la pobreza? Si dirán, es que genera empleos, ¿no? Este tipo de industria genera empleos. Sí genera empleos, pero genera dos cuestiones. Genera empleos locales, o sea, donde se extrae justamente es algo muy local. Entonces, ahí contratan a personas locales. ¿Y qué sucede con las capacidades humanas? Que tienen una relación aquí con la capacidad humana, que se vuelven especializados en ello. Y además no es permanente. O sea, una vez que se termina como de extraer, pues las personas se quedan sin empleo y nuevamente el ciclo, ¿no? de pobreza. Otro factor importante también, que genera empleo informal. O sea, no ayuda, digamos, a una permanencia de empleos formales. El empleo informal en América Latina es altísimo, es de los más altos, es el 53% de empleo informal, sin mencionar México, que estamos en el 57%. Es muy alto. Entonces, ¿qué sucede con eso? Va generando el que la gente justo no tenga beneficios sociales, no se paguen impuestos y a la vez también el Estado no puede invertir en mejores cuestiones para la población, ¿no? Como saneamiento, agua, limpieza, educación, salud. Entonces, aquí pasamos justo a la relación con capacidades humanas, ¿no? Que justo para aumentar las habilidades humanas depende mucho la inversión del Estado para salud y educación. Entonces, su capacidad es poca, ¿no? Porque depende de la capacidad fiscal, el pago de impuestos y del Producto Interno Bruto. Entonces, si contamos con esta participación de que no hay manufactura y se sigue con el empleo informal, pues no va a haber mayor inversión a eso, ¿no? Lo que el doctor Santosh estaba haciendo el comparativo es con el de Asia, que como saben ustedes, pues es China, Japón, sur y norte de Corea, Taiwán, Hong Kong, Mongolia y Macao, ¿no? Estos países. Justo ellos es como ejemplo, ¿no? Porque ellos invirtieron a partir de los años 1980, justo empezaron a invertir en educación y salud básica. Es decir, sí hay educación y salud, eso es lo que también se menciona, pero a un nivel para ricos, a un nivel para gente que pueda acceder y pagarlo. Pero nosotros estamos hablando de la mayoría de la población y del crecimiento de países sostenibles en América Latina, ¿no? Entonces, eso es para una pequeña parte de la población. La idea es hacerlo público y general, lo que hizo Asia, ¿no? Justamente lo que se convirtió en la manufactura del mundo, que es lo que conocemos ahora, porque lo tiene controlado esa manufactura. Ahí se les da desarrollo, crecimiento, capacitación, y justo van obteniendo pues mayor ingreso para el Estado pueda volver a invertir. Ahora, otro factor es que interfieren los bancos. Regularmente en la industria extractiva son bancos internacionales que genera gran vulnerabilidad económica. O sea, se depende de otro tipo de factores. Aquí el punto es que pocos bancos locales existen, ¿no? Entonces, en América Latina, pues la mayoría son dominados por bancos extranjeros, lo que voy para allá con esta parte muy interesante. Genera que entonces este tipo de bancos no les interese generar mayor ahorro en los hogares o como en las pequeñas cuentas, ¿no? Les interesa las grandes inversiones. ¿Qué sucede en estos hogares? Se quedan sin capacidad financiera porque el poco dinero que obtienen lo van ahorrando en otro tipo de cosas como joyas o como pues dinero en efectivo, ¿no? Lo cual ese dinero se estanca y no va generando más dinero y no va generando una cultura de ahorro a las personas, ¿no? Porque digamos, no le interesa a este tipo de bancos, pues apoyar, ¿no? A este tipo de poblaciones, ¿no? Lo cual, pues un buen sistema financiero es el que genera ahorro, porque el ahorro te genera inversión y se da nuevamente el ciclo, ¿no? El 16% en América Latina dice ahorrar, el 16% de la población, pero fíjense, el 40% en Asia y el 50% en países avanzados o desarrollados. O sea, estamos muy por debajo en la educación financiera y en el apoyo al ahorro, ¿no? Entonces, ya por último es la relación entre la formación y de capacidades humanas, ¿no? Con el crecimiento económico y la pobreza. Sabemos que en América Latina somos de los países con mayores desigualdades, por lo antes mencionado, ¿no? Todo lo anterior. Ajá. Y es como iba cerrando el doctor Santosh, dice, sí, todo esto tiene que ver, ¿no? Cómo se va manejando la economía y las inversiones extranjeras. Sin embargo, también hay que tomar en cuenta que la población va envejeciendo, igual que Asia. Entonces, ¿qué tipo de planes, qué tipo de políticas públicas se está teniendo para poder soportar esta situación futura? O sea, el envejecimiento pues es algo que no se puede parar. Entonces, ¿qué tipo de sistemas de salud vas a ofrecer a tu población? ¿No? ¿Y qué tipo de sistema de pensiones vas a ofrecer? Si no tienes como la infraestructura actual. Entonces, ¿qué pasa con la fuerza laboral actual? ¿No? Que son los jóvenes, ¿no? Que pudieran ser ustedes. ¿Qué pasa con esa fuerza laboral? Ustedes van a tener que sustentar, digamos, todos esos cambios y todo lo anterior. ¿Qué es lo que pasará? Y es como cierra él proponiendo tres elementos interesantes, ¿no? Que dice, ¿cuáles serían las soluciones? ¿No? Porque el punto no es exponer el problema, aquí se da todo un análisis de la problemática de por qué estamos estancados como países en el crecimiento económico, pero da soluciones. O sea, implicaciones del crecimiento, pobreza, dice, justo reducir la dependencia de la extracción, ¿no? El punto es crear más empleos, crear más industria y capacidades en trabajos, ¿no? Que es una lección que debemos aprender del este de Asia. Cómo ellos generaron empleo a partir de la industria de manufactura. Dos, las implicaciones del crecimiento hacia capital humano. Se aumenta la capacidad fiscal del Estado en salud, educación y beneficios sociales. Es decir, debe de haber nuevas formas de movilizar impuestos o de recabar ingresos para el Estado, para justo reducir esta desigualdad y que se pueda invertir más y mejor en sistemas básicos, ¿no? Como es la salud o la educación. Y tener mayor dependencia a los bancos nacionales, ¿no? Lo que va a movilizar mayor el ahorro y esta educación hasta el ahorro de estas familias, ¿no? Y el último, la implicación del capital humano con pobreza, sí, aumentar la asignación presupuestaria en sanidad y educación, ya que ha comenzado el envejecimiento. O sea, es decir, tenemos que irnos preparando hacia lo que va a pasar en el futuro en América Latina, ¿no? Que también los trabajadores informales puedan beneficiarse de esta seguridad social, o sea, que se encuentren formas o políticas públicas de cómo incluirlos para que tengan oportunidad de acceder, pero a la vez también el Estado pueda tener un poco de oportunidad de atraer un poco más de inversión en este sistema y poder invertirlo en salud pública. Entonces, agradezco mucho, doctor. Ahora, ¿le parece si le cedemos la palabra al doctor Daniel Koster, de favor?
Okay, Daniel, let me just say a few words about you. First of all, thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Daniel Costa has had a very illustrious career in the Argentinian government, but also internationally. He has worked as a senior economist in many parts of Asia, and for ILO and for UNDP. And in addition, for the Argentinian government, he's been Argentina's executive director at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. And currently, of course, he's based in Brussels, where he is the chief economist of the International Confederation of Trade Unions. So welcome, Dr. Costa, and thank you for joining us. The floor is yours, sir. You've read the book.
Thank you very much, Santosh. A couple of corrections. Number one, I'm not a doctor. I have a PhD interruptus. I stopped my PhD when I was called to join the Argentinian government of the Ministry of Labor, and then never went back to the formal studies. So it's the thesis is remaining.
We shall forgive you that sin.
Yeah, and second, I was executive director at the World Bank, not the IMF. But for the rest, it's okay. My grandfather always told me that friends should be praised publicly and criticized privately. So perhaps I will be very nice with you, although I have a couple of comments, or perhaps we can a bit mix the two things, because we are talking to students, and it's important, to try to shuffle ideas, and that's why I accepted this challenge, to come here.
Please feel free to speak in Spanish.
Okay, no, but okay. No, yo creo, con Santosh tenemos una relación de hace muchos años, posiblemente 20 ya, nos conocimos transitando el mundo con todas estas discusiones sobre programas de empleo, intervenciones en el mercado de trabajo, buscando de mejorar las cosas. Siempre nos cruzamos por distintos lugares, inclusive cuando yo estaba en el Ministerio de Trabajo y después en el Programa de las Naciones Unidas para el Desarrollo en Argentina. Él vino a Argentina. Yo tuve oportunidad de ir a India y verlo allá cuando yo estaba basado en Myanmar. Y bueno, tenemos una historia en común. Hecha esta salvedad, vamos a hablar del libro y me voy a tomar unos 10 minutos. Del libro y de Santosh. Santosh es lo que uno definiría un economista heterodoxo. Heterodoxo porque tiene una profunda reacción contra la ortodoxia tradicional de pensar que el problema son el funcionamiento de los mercados, que fijando el precio correcto se mejora la distribución de los recursos y va a mejorar todo. Entonces, set the price right y el crecimiento va a venir, y todo va a venir, como él mismo lo expresa en su texto. De todos modos, dentro de la heterodoxia, es un heterodoxo de la heterodoxia. Santosh utiliza una serie de herramientas de un modo que es muy interesante, es muy creativo, es muy original, y que me parece que dan para algún tipo de análisis un poco más detallado, ¿no es cierto? La idea esta que plantea él sobre la ampliación de funcionamientos es una idea bien interesante y bien original. Ahora, me parece que el punto que diría yo más conflictivo, de acuerdo a mi visión sobre el libro, es justamente en la comparación entre América Latina y Asia. Él separa hacer un análisis de un Asia en un momento que es mucho más parecido, paradójicamente, a la América Latina de los años 50, 60 que a la América Latina de hoy. En términos de su ubicación global, de su ubicación en relación al desarrollo. ¿Y por qué digo esto? ¿Dónde es que yo planteo esto? Yo creo que el desarrollo de América Latina, del periodo, como les decía, de los 40-50, basado en la industrialización sustitutiva de importaciones, en las grandes migraciones rurales urbanas, en el desarrollo de un proletariado urbano que se dio básicamente en países como México, como Brasil, como Argentina, pero inclusive en los países un poco más pequeños, como Chile o como puede haber sido Uruguay, me parece que es mucho más parecido a lo que está pasando en algunos de los países asiáticos, donde vemos, número uno, una gran migración urbana-rural, donde vemos un comienzo de un desarrollo de un mercado que genera otro tipo de dinámica, donde vemos un abandono de la economía agropecuaria para autosustento, para pasar a una transición al mercado. Entonces, en rasgos generales, estamos comparando dos situaciones que tienen una cierta dosis de asincronía. Creo que hay algunos números que no me terminan de cerrar. Es cierto que en Asia la tasa de ahorro es muchísimo más alta que en América Latina, lo que sí no creo que sea un resultado del sistema financiero. En Asia, la mayor parte de la gente ahorra al margen del sistema financiero. En Asia, la gente ahorra comprando oro, comprando divisa algunos, comprando tierra, pero no están en instrumentos financieros para el ahorro. Lo que se ahorra en Asia, en el sistema financiero, es relativamente marginal comparado con América Latina. Pero es cierto, países como Vietnam tienen una tasa de ahorro del 50%. ¿Sí? El 30%, 35% son tasas habituales de ahorro en Asia. En América Latina, cuando conseguimos llegar al 20%, lo celebramos. Yo creo que él sintetiza de una manera demasiado esquemática y estática el modelo extractivista. Y hace un análisis que de algún modo está exento de la dimensión de política de la economía, ¿sí? El desarrollo industrial latinoamericano que se dio arrancando con una burguesía local en países como México, como Argentina, como Brasil, choca rápidamente con un problema de escalas por falta de integración y por un problema de patentes, marcas y dominancia de las empresas multinacionales. En América Latina llegamos a tener una fábrica de automóviles de General Motors en Argentina, en Brasil, en Venezuela, en Colombia, en México, donde todas estaban orientadas al mercado interno. En cambio, en Asia hay un cambio de paradigma productivo que expande esos mercados y otorga una ampliación de mercados que es mucho más alta. Entonces, reitero, me parece que la comparación en ese punto no es del todo razonable. Latinoamérica tiene otro problema que Yo no me recuerdo quién lo había dicho, pero se lo escuché alguna vez a Carlos Fuentes, que es sobre México, tan lejos de Dios y tan cerca de los Estados Unidos, ¿sí? Y yo creo que ese es uno de los problemas también que tuvo América Latina en general, de tener esta relación de tanta tensión y de tanto, además, con fenómenos de una burguesía demasiado alineada a veces con los poderes, internacionales, la famosa maldición de Malinche que se habla tanto en México, ¿no es cierto?, que llevaron a frenar el desarrollo. Entonces me parece que un análisis de América Latina al margen de una visión más política, como se hizo en los años 60 y 70, a partir de la teoría de la dependencia y de toda esta literatura que mostraba estas tensiones, me parece que también está un poco limitada. Yo creo que uno de los temas centrales, para no ir en tantos detalles, creo que la principal causa de la baja elasticidad, pobreza del crecimiento en América Latina, and perhaps I will say this in English because I would like you to know what I believe. The low elasticity to growth of poverty in America Latina is only the result of the very high Gini coefficient, the very high inequality in Latin America. It's not a problem of the informal market. The informal market in Latin America is not larger than in Asia at all. Tax collection in Latin America is not lower than in Asia at all. Across the board in Asia, yeah? Across the board in Asia, the level of tax evasion and informality in every single country in Asia, perhaps Singapore is the exception, but Singapore, it's not a country, it's something else, yeah? It's not lower. I think that the main problem in Latin America is this very, I would say, crystallized and consistent level of inequality that reduce the possibilities that economic growth will be transferred to the households, that the overall social effort of economic growth is distributed in such a way that doesn't reach the households. But also, the other issue is that what has been happening in Latin America since the 80s, the 1980s, is that you had a process of polarization where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, but on top of that, heterogenization of the poor people. The poor are less homogeneous in Latin America than what you find in Asia. And that also precludes or limits the effectiveness and efficiency of interventions for the poor. Unless there is a crisis, like happened in Argentina in the 2000, with all with 56% of poverty and 25% of unemployment, you go with an employment plan and you reach a broad base of the poor people and those that they need. When you have more heterogeneous poverty, that it's not only because of unemployment, but then you have to have the structural poverty and the different things and the working poor and the informal sector and all these different characteristics of poverty, the intervention of political interventions to reduce poverty became much more unequal. So I will stop here. Perhaps we can have another discussion on some of these issues, but I think that the main difference and the crucial factor between the difference between Asia and Latin America are, number one, the level of inequality, number two, when they started the process of development. I completely disagree with the concept that you said, the middle income trap. I think that the middle income trap is not because you reach middle income, is a trap that you get when the poor, they think that they can still progress, and the rich, they still think that they can live like the rich in Europe or in the United States, and they fly the capital that they get. That's my vision about that. Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here, and let's continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Daniel. No, doctor, pero Daniel.
No, Daniel está bien.
Y bueno, justo dicen, ¿no? Hoy es el día del amor y la amistad, entonces los amigos se dicen lo que sienten y la verdad. Entonces, muchas gracias por la intervención. Y es en estas ideas, en el rebote de ideas, donde se da realmente los cambios. Entonces, agradecemos muchísimo su intervención y su crítica, y pasaremos ahora con la doctora Jenny, porque ya viene la sección de preguntas y respuestas, ¿verdad?
Sí. Thank you. There are many questions in the chat about this topic. The first one is, I read in Spanish and then I translate. ¿Qué estrategia se puede utilizar para reducir el empleo informal? What strategy can be used to reduce informal employment? Dr. Santos?
Right. Not the easiest of questions. I think what I argued in my first several slides was that almost all countries need a much more explicit industrial policy or manufacturing strategy. If they did, what you will get is much more formal employment being generated in most of the economies, because you have the natural resources, those can be converted within each of the countries. They don't have to be necessarily exported. Please remember that since the global economic crisis of 2008, about 100 countries of the world have adopted industrial policies, which means that most of the countries have adopted it. It's not entirely clear to me why this pattern has not taken root enough. It's probably taken some root in Latin American policymakers' offices. Because if it did, it would generate jobs, and that would generate services and modern services, tradable services. So in other words, you would have more formal jobs in industry. You'd have more formal jobs in perhaps the infrastructure investment that would be needed to enable manufacturing to grow. And as a result of both these, you will have more services jobs in the formal sector. So it's possible, but it also means, and it's actually, we are at that phase in I think, the development of Latin American countries that is possible if policymakers were to decide to do that. Because if they decided to do that, you will get the kind of virtuous circle that is implied in the dual synergies. Infrastructure attracting in manufacturing, which is in turn derivatively leading to services. And I'm telling you, Vietnam has shown it. In recent years, in the last 10 to 15 years, manufacturing has grown rapidly in Vietnam. And as a result of that, informality has dropped. Certainly in the industrial sector, informality has dropped. So in the interest of being able to answer other questions, I think I'll stop there.
If I can make a small comment in relation to this.
Please.
The best way of reducing informality is to have very clear what are the determinants of informality. and also to have a clear taxonomy of informality. Informality is not an homogeneous mass of workers, as always is say, something that you define by the negative. It's always a bad definition, and informality is defining those workers that they don't have social protection. That's the main way of defining it. But in the framework of informality, you have self-employed workers, you have domestic workers, you have non-registered or non-declared to the Social Security workers, and those are between 1/3 and 35% of the informal sector. Workers that are non-declared to the Social Security, but they are working in formal enterprises. They share their job with workers that are declared to the Social Security. So why this thing happened? Mainly because these enterprises, they have non-declared money. They didn't declare sales, they don't pay income tax, they don't pay sales tax, and with that cash that they have, that they cannot go to the bank because the taxing authorities are going to identify them, they pay informal workers or non-declared workers. So the best way of reduce at least 10 to 15 points informality is to strengthen the tax collection, to strengthen labor inspection and tax inspection. With these other sectors, those that they are self-employed, low productivity activities, and all these other things, it's much more difficult. Domestic workers, they could also be registered if the government will put in place the right policies. Yeah, but the issue, the central issue is that if you don't have informal money, non-declared money, you wouldn't have non-declared workers, because otherwise you will be paying higher income taxes and sales taxes.
I just add one sentence to that, Daniel. I agree with what you've just said, but for the benefit of the young person who asked that question, let me just say, you can have self-employed people who are not in an employer-employee relationship included in the Social Security system.
Sure.
That's legally
Yes.
possible. It just has to be enabled. And if the tax revenues rise, as Daniel was suggesting, the capacity of the state to subsidize some of these self-employed people to join the Social Security system can be enabled, can be facilitated. So, you know, many of the things that what Daniel and I are saying are actually complementary to each other.
Perfect. Thank you. There are the second question. ¿Cuál sería el punto de partida para realizar los cambios que indican, que ustedes indican? ¿Empezar por el gobierno o por las empresas privadas? What would be the starting point to make the change indicated? Start with the government or with private companies?
The government has to first recognize that the problem, and then once they initiate, I mean, if they have the will for change, then they initiate the process and work with the private companies and work with the workers together.
Perfect. And the other question, la educación financiera en México va creciendo, pero aún no permea en todo el país. ¿Cuál sería una técnica para difundir este tipo de educación? Financial education in Mexico is growing, but it still doesn't not permeate to all the country. What would be a technique or strategy to disseminate this type of education?
Daniel, you want to take that?
Well, you know, I think that the main problem is how to mobilize the resources from the financial sector into the production. Yeah, and that's a key issue. And there
I discussed that through the banking
Yeah.
system. Yeah, I discussed that.
So you need in general, it's not a problem to educate the public on financial education in order to move that money to the production. The thing is that has to be attractive, but also one of the main problems that we face since the crisis of the 80s was the process of appreciation and capital valorization, where companies, they started to the financial person was much more important than the productive engineer. So they made more money making financial transactions, buying foreign exchange, and doing whatever type of instruments rather than concentrate in production and increase productivity and have a lower the cost of production. That requires, as well as the first question, the previous question that was asked, the idea of a new social contract. Yeah, because if there is something that happened in Asia, Santosh gave the example of Vietnam. In his book, you read all over the example of South Korea. In those countries, we like it or not, with democratic governments or more authoritarian, you had a very strong social contract in relation to what's the path where things are going. In Korea, for example, you would get a loan from the bank and you commit export. And if you didn't achieve the level of export that you committed with the bank, you would end up in jail, yeah, as an entrepreneur. It's not a very nice way, but you can think how many entrepreneurs in Latin America would be in jail if that would be one of the conditions. You need the idea of a social construct that would bring all the people together. Something similar to what happened in the early stages of development of the 50s and 60s, where you had this kind of social agreement between workers and capitalists, where the workers were the demand for the capitalists. So if you produce more shirts, your workers are going to buy those shirts. So if the government decided an increase in the minimum wage, that affect in principle, your cost, but you were going to recover that with the economic growth. The problem is that the model of free globalized markets has changed the pattern of growth in the Latin American economies. In the past, was like the yeast in the dough. The model will be everything will grow more or less together, slowly, but together. Now, with the open economies, the globalization, you break all these process of articulations that you had, and you have like a mushrooms. They grow one here, the other here, and in the middle, nothing. You have very rich people, very successful sectors.
Which is what I was talking about. Which is what I was talking about, Daniel, because if you have foreign banks, then they tend to be urban-centric. They don't have that many branches. They're not interested in mobilizing the savings of the poor. They don't have that many branches. If you don't have branches, how are the poor supposed to bank? Where are they supposed to bank? That means, you know, they may not end up, you know, their savings might not be available to the banking system generally. And if that's the case, then you have relatively lower savings. So, I mean, please remember that, you know, tax to GDP ratio might be similar between Asia and here, but the savings to GDP ratio is very different, double. And a lot has to do with the network of banks. So it's as simple as that to some extent. And the majority of the banks in Asia are domestic. And they have branches all over the place, so that the savings of the ordinary people are being mobilized constantly, and they are available.
I would tend to have a slight disagreement there. Yeah, I saw what happened in Cambodia, in Myanmar, in Indonesia. The savings are not in the banks. The savings are in gold. People like to buy gold. You know, even countries very in poor regions of Myanmar, you would see the gold shop there where the people go and they buy.
Daniel,
by land.
Myanmar is not a good example. Myanmar is a low, low end of the low middle income country.
Okay,
It's quite
Cambodia,
pathetically poor, actually.
Thailand.
No, I'm not denying the attraction of gold. I'm just saying
No.
there's much more potential. The savings rate to GDP is much higher, and there are obviously
It's
institutional
double.
reasons for that.
At the minimum is double. You have countries like Vietnam. They have a savings to GDP of 47–50% depending on the year. China the same,
Tremendous.
Thailand, which is one of the lowest, 35. In Latin America, when you reach 20%, you start to clap.
Yeah, exactly. This is what I'm trying to say. I mean, India is much lower per capita income, $2,200. India's savings rate is always, in the last 15 years, it's been consistently above 30%.
But I would also ask a question which is a bit heterogeneous in the answer. Social protection in Latin America is much stronger. Pension systems and even you have countries like Argentina that they have a 96% of coverage of the pension system for the age. In Asia, pension systems are very small. They don't have enough coverage.
True.
I would also ask to what extent the high rate of savings is precisely because they need to save for the future.
For a rainy day.
And in Asia, you wouldn't see a younger person letting not only the parents, letting the auntie, the aunt or the uncle be needed. Yeah, the level of help to the elderly in Asia is much more widespread and interesting than what we have in Latin America. So it's a.
I know you're bringing in some very interesting dimensions, but I think we should let other young people ask questions.
Sure.
Perfect. I'm going to the last question. Is ¿puede haber una población heterogénea? Could we have the population homogeneous? I think that is from economy that all the people the same status could be in one country.
I didn't understand that question. Did you? Why don't you say it in Spanish and maybe Daniel can address it?
¿Puede haber una población homogénea? Supongo que es sobre la economía, que todos estén en el mismo estatus económico.
Seguramente siempre va a haber heterogeneidad. For sure, always you will have a heterogeneity. The difference is if you can have a population that is living under a standard of living, a sensible, or si pueden vivir abajo de un nivel de vida digno. Eso es lo que no se puede permitir.
Perfect. Well, unfortunately, we are running out of time, so I will read their certificate of appreciation. Okay. The National Autonomous University of Mexico Faculty of Accountancy and Management gives this certificate of appreciation to PH Santos Merotra, PH Coster, and PH Belmont for their presentation of given on 13th of February 2023 at the University City, Mexico City, signed by our director, Tomás Humberto Rubio Pérez. Thank you, Dr. Santos, Dr. Coster, and Belmont.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Sí, muchas gracias. Muchas
gracias. Un gusto.
Above all, thank you very much, Jenny.
Thank you. Y chicos, recuerden que pueden encontrar el libro gratuito en publishing.fca.unam.mx y los invitamos a seguir las conferencias de la Expo Libros y Revistas. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Adiós.
Bye.
Thank you. Un placer.